My son took my ex-husband and his polished new wife to meet his fiancée's family, erasing me like some shameful smudge. I did not cry, call, or post a single word. I merely withdrew exactly one signature. The next morning, all three of them stormed into my house acting as if I had torched the entire wedding. The truth is, I just stopped financially underwriting their perfect lie. My name is Zoe Campbell. I live alone in a quiet, heavily wooded suburb just outside of Pittsburgh. The house I reside in is entirely my own, a modest but sturdy split-level structure I purchased precisely 11 years ago. The ink drying on the deed just months after my divorce was finalized. My life here is intensely ordered. The lawn is always trimmed, the gutters are always cleared before the first snow, and the pantry is stocked with an exactness that borders on the clinical. I keep a tight, disciplined schedule. I have a small circle of acquaintances, but I would not call my life lonely. I am simply unbothered by the noise of other people's chaos. I am not a fragile woman. Working as a senior safety investigator for the Transit Authority has trained me to look at wreckage, analyze the structural failures, and document the damage without letting my hands shake. I apply that same cold precision to my personal life. My ex-husband, Grant Holloway, possesses no such discipline. We divorced 11 years ago because Grant decided the life we had built was too grounded, too steeped in the mundane realities of mortgages and dental bills. He packed his bags and ran toward a glossy, high-definition version of existence, eventually marrying Sloan. Sloan Holloway is the kind of woman who treats social interaction as a competitive sport. She is an expert at walking into a room and instantly rendering everyone else a muted background prop. Her hair is always perfectly blown out, her teeth blindingly white, her laughter calibrated to sound rich and entirely unburdened. Grant wanted to live in a magazine spread, and Sloan was the perfect art director for the job. Then there is my son, Mason Holloway. He is 27 years old now, making his living in the branding industry down in Washington, District of Columbia. Given the events that have recently unfolded, his choice of career feels painfully ironic. Mason makes his money managing public perceptions, deciding what to highlight and what to crop out of the frame. He recently became engaged to Eliza Penrose. The Penrose family represents the kind of old, deeply entrenched wealth that practically hums through the historic avenues of Richmond, Virginia. They do not just have money, they have generational legacy, sprawling estates, and a carefully guarded social circle that requires the right kind of pedigree to enter. Mason, desperately eager to fit into this rarefied world, has spent the last 2 years polishing his own edges to match theirs. It happened on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon. The early autumn air was just beginning to carry that sharp, metallic chill that signals the end of the year. I was standing in my kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, watching the wind strip the dead leaves from the oak tree in the backyard. My phone vibrated against the granite countertop. It was a text message from Mason. The message was long, cheerful in a manufactured way, and thoroughly rehearsed. He was writing to let me know that he was taking Grant and Sloan down to Richmond for the weekend. They were going to spend the weekend with Eliza's parents, walk the grounds of the family estate, and finalize the preliminary steps for the wedding preparations. He detailed the dinner reservations, the country club brunch, and the suit he was picking up from the tailor. He wrote all of this as if he were delivering an itinerary to an assistant. I read the screen once. Then I read it again. The silence in the kitchen felt suddenly very heavy. I did not feel an immediate rush of anger. Instead, I felt the cold, familiar sensation of a structural beam snapping under pressure. I placed my tea mug down on the counter. I picked up the phone and typed a very short reply. "What about me?" I pressed send. Then, I waited. I waited for a very long time. I watched the typing indicator bubble appear, dance on the screen for several seconds, and then vanish. Then it appeared again, vanished again. Mason was drafting and deleting, trying to find the precise combination of words that would soften the blow of what he was actually doing. 10 minutes passed. The kettle screamed. I poured my water, steeped my tea, and stood perfectly still by the island counter, Finally, his reply came through. He typed that the Penrose family was very traditional. He explained that everything needed to be neat and tidy for this initial meeting. He claimed that bringing only his father and his stepmother would simply be easier to handle for everyone involved. He wrapped the rejection in the language of logistical convenience, as if my presence were merely a scheduling conflict rather than a biological fact. I stared at the glowing letters. Easier to handle. I set my tea down and typed back, pushing him out of his comfortable corner of evasion. Easier for whom? That was when Mason finally dropped the polished branding routine and revealed the ugly, unvarnished truth. His next message was defensive, clipped, and deeply cruel. He confessed that he did not want to have to explain too much about me to his future in-laws. He did not want to explain why his mother was a transit safety investigator instead of a country club patron. He did not want to explain the divorce, the separate households, or the lack of a glossy pedigree on my side of the aisle. I was not the right aesthetic for the Penrose family. I was a complication. I was a rough edge he wanted to sand down before presenting himself to his wealthy new family. I stood in the fading afternoon light, the warmth of my tea completely forgotten. I did not write a paragraph demanding respect. I did not call him to scream, cry, or beg for a seat at a table that clearly did not want me. I simply typed 2 words. I understand. And I did understand. In my chest. A heavy, unshakable clarity settled in. I knew exactly what this was. This was no longer just the thoughtlessness of a busy young man. This was a deliberate, calculated action. It was an act of complete erasure. Mason was actively taking a pair of scissors to our family picture and cleanly snipping me out of the frame. That night, the quiet of my house, which usually brought me so much peace, felt like a vacuum pressing against my ears. I went to bed at 10 o'clock, but sleep absolutely refused to come. I lay on my back, staring at the shadows cast by the street lamp through the bedroom blinds, and the memories came flooding back, thick and suffocating. I remembered the decades of night shifts, the thousands of hours I spent awake in the freezing dark, pulling double duty so we could afford the mortgage that Grant eventually walked away from. I remembered running frantically between my office, the emergency room when Mason broke his arm, the elementary school for parent-teacher conferences, and the desolate parking lots of grocery stores at midnight. I remembered the sheer, grinding exhaustion of being the only adult in the room. I remembered the countless times Grant had simply vanished when things became difficult. He was absent for the flu seasons, the failed math tests, the teenage rebellions, and the crushing weight of daily parenting. Whenever the reality of raising a child required sweat and sacrifice, Grant was conveniently occupied elsewhere. And through every single one of those absences, I was the one who showed up. I was always there, precisely on time, holding the pieces together. I had built the very foundation that Mason now stood upon. I had paved the road that allowed him to walk into his polished life in Washington. Yet, as I lay in the dark, the bitter truth washed over me. I was good enough to do the heavy lifting in the shadows, but I was considered too embarrassing to stand in the light. Mason had looked at the life I sacrificed to give him, and he had decided it was something to hide. I did not shed a single tear that night. Crying is for when you are hurt and hoping for comfort. I was not hoping for comfort. I was simply observing the wreckage of my own family, analyzing the failure, and preparing for the absolute certainty of what I had to do next. The light at 7 in the morning was unforgiving. It cut through the kitchen blinds in sharp, geometric lines, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. I had already finished my first cup of black coffee. I picked up my phone to check the local weather, a lingering habit from my commuting days, but a notification banner caught my eye first. It was Instagram. Mason had posted a new photograph. I tapped the screen. The image loaded, and the atmosphere in my kitchen instantly shifted, the air growing thin and brittle. It was a beautifully composed picture, shot outside a notoriously exclusive restaurant in the historic district of Richmond. The background was a tapestry of gas lanterns, climbing ivy, and the soft, amber glow of expensive dining. In the center of the frame stood the 3 of them. Grant wore a tailored navy blazer that masked the softening lines of his age, projecting an air of established authority. Sloane stood to Mason's left, draped in a cream-colored silk trench coat that practically whispered generational wealth. Her hand resting lightly, affectionately, on Mason's arm, and in the middle was my son. He looked flawless. His posture was straight, his hair perfectly styled, his clothes emitting that subtle sheen of expensive tailoring. But it was not the image itself that served as the blade. It was the text beneath it. I read the caption. Then I read it again, letting the syllables form quietly in the empty room. Grateful for dinner with my parents before the big family weekend. My parents, not my father and Sloane, not my dad and his wife, my parents. The words were a public declaration, a rewriting of history published for his hundreds of followers, his colleagues, and most importantly, his future in-laws to see. He had not merely omitted me from the itinerary. He had actively replaced me. He had cast Sloane in the role of the mother, sliding her into the vacant slot because she fit the color palette and the socioeconomic profile he was trying to project. She was the display version, the upgraded model, polished and ready for the showroom floor. I zoomed in on the photograph. I studied Mason's face with the same detached, clinical intensity I used when examining the fractured steel of a derailed train car. I was looking for the stress points. I was looking for a flicker of guilt, a forced tightness around the eyes, the subtle discomfort of a man telling a massive, foundational lie. There was none. That was the detail that finally shattered the glass. Mason was smiling. It was a wide, genuine, incredibly relaxed smile. It was the expression of a man who believed entirely in the righteousness of his own actions. He felt no shame in erasing me because, in his mind, he was simply fixing a marketing problem. He was curating his brand. I was an inconvenient truth that did not test well with his new target audience, so I was cut from the final edit. He was completely at peace with it. In the movies, this is the moment the betrayed mother shatters a coffee mug against the wall. She falls to her knees, weeping into her hands, or she furiously dials her child's number to scream into the receiver, demanding an explanation, demanding to be seen. I did none of those things. I did not leave a passive-aggressive comment beneath the photo. I did not text Grant to curse him. I did not shed a single tear. Panic and rage are loud, chaotic things. Betrayal of this magnitude, however, demands absolute, terrifying silence. I locked the screen of my phone and set it face down on the granite counter. The sound of the plastic case hitting the stone was the only noise in the house. I walked out of the kitchen, my footsteps slow and deliberate on the hardwood floor. I bypassed the living room and went straight into my home office. The room was Spartan, dominated by a heavy oak desk and a wall of meticulously organized filing cabinets. I sat down in the leather chair, woke up my laptop, and listened to the quiet hum of the cooling fan. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the secure portal of a major national bank. My mind rewound to a frantic phone call I had received exactly 4 months prior. Mason had been pacing his apartment in Washington, his voice tight with genuine panic. He and Eliza had found the perfect property, a sleek, ultra-modern luxury condo in Alexandria, Virginia. It was exactly the kind of address a rising branding executive and his wealthy fiancée needed to establish their foothold. There was only one problem. While Mason made a respectable salary, his debt-to-income ratio, heavily skewed by his expensive lifestyle and a luxury car lease, had spooked the strict underwriters. The bank was demanding a guarantor, someone with an unblemished financial history, zero debt, and a perfect credit score. He had begged me. He had used his most persuasive, vulnerable voice, the one he had perfected as a teenager when he needed bailing out of trouble. He promised it was just a formality, a temporary safety net to ensure they could close on the property before the wedding planning consumed their lives. I had agreed. I had submitted my tax returns, my bank statements, and my spotless credit history. I had signed the extensive legal documents, placing the entire weight of my financial security beneath his foundation, acting as the invisible concrete pillar holding up his new, glossy life. Now, sitting in the blue light of the monitor, I clicked through the portal until I found the contact directory for the loan origination team. I opened a new email draft. I did not write a manifesto. I did not express my hurt or mention the photograph in Richmond. I operated purely within the realm of cold, hard leverage. I addressed the email directly to the senior underwriter assigned to the Alexandria property file. "To whom it may concern," I typed, the keys clacking sharply like small gunshots in the quiet room. "Effective immediately. I am formally withdrawing my consent and signature as the financial guarantor for the mortgage application associated with Mason Holloway. Please halt all processing dependent on my financial backing and provide me with written confirmation of this withdrawal by the end of the business day." I attached my electronic signature, my phone number, and my legal address. I read the 2 sentences one more time. They were perfectly sterile, lethally precise. I clicked send. The progress bar flashed green. The email vanished into the server. I closed the laptop. The snap of the lid shutting sounded incredibly loud. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the quiet suburban street. The realization settled over me, heavy and cold as an iron blanket. Mason wanted the absolute best of both worlds. He wanted me to vanish from the dining table. He wanted to hide my working-class hands and my quiet life from the Penrose family. He wanted to erase the woman who had actually raised him so he could pretend to be the son of a high-society interior designer, but he still expected my signature to remain firmly planted on his future. He wanted the ghost to pay the mortgage. He wanted a mother who existed entirely on paper, locked away in a bank vault, silently underwriting the very lifestyle that excluded her. He had calculated the social cost of acknowledging me and deemed it too high. I had simply calculated the financial cost of supporting a stranger and adjusted my portfolio accordingly. I spent the rest of the day in a state of tranquil productivity. I cleaned the baseboards. I went to the grocery store. I repotted a fern that had outgrown its ceramic container. I felt no anxiety, only the deep, stabilizing rhythm of a consequence being set into motion. At 8 o'clock that evening, while I was washing my dinner plate, the automated systems of the financial world did their job. I did not see Mason's face when he received the notification. I did not hear the chime of his phone interrupting his elegant dinner with the Penrose family. But I knew exactly what the automated message from the lender's secure portal said, because a blind copy had been routed to my inbox for my records. It was a standard, system-generated alert, entirely devoid of emotion, yet carrying the destructive force of a wrecking ball swinging straight through his carefully constructed reality. Guarantor approval withdrawn. Closing placed on hold. At exactly 8:30 on Sunday morning, the sharp crunch of gravel shattered the weekend quiet of my property. I was standing by the kitchen sink, running warm water over a ceramic plate, when I heard the engines. Through the window positioned above the sink, I watched 2 expensive vehicles pull aggressively into my driveway. The first was a sleek black luxury sedan. The second was a pristine silver crossover. They parked at haphazard angles, completely ignoring the designated lines of the concrete pad. Car doors slammed in rapid, echoing succession. Footsteps pounded heavily up the wooden steps of my back porch. The deadbolt clicked and turned. Mason still possessed a key to this house. They did not knock. They did not ring the bell. They did not pause in the mudroom to remove their shoes. All 3 of them breached the threshold and marched directly into my kitchen with the frantic, aggressive energy of an assault team responding to a high-stakes emergency. They entered my home acting entirely as if they were the victims of a grievous, unprovoked betrayal. Mason spearheaded the charge. He looked visibly disheveled, a shocking departure from the curated, flawless perfection he had projected just 24 hours prior. His shoulders were hiked up around his ears, his jaw clamped so tightly the muscles fluttered beneath his skin. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a customary morning greeting. He stopped abruptly 3 feet away from the kitchen island, planted both hands flat on the cool granite surface, and leaned forward. "You pulled my guarantor approval," he demanded. His voice was breathless. pitched a half octave higher than usual. I reached for the glass carafe resting on the coffee maker. The brew was fresh, sending a dark, earthy aroma into the sudden tension polluting the room. I poured a slow, deliberate stream into my mug. The liquid hit the ceramic with a soft, rhythmic sound. I took my time, allowing the silence to stretch. I did, I confirmed calmly. I took a small sip, keeping my gaze level and my posture entirely relaxed. I offered no apology, no defensive explanation, and no change in volume. I simply let those 2 syllables hang in the air, forcing all 3 of them to listen to the frantic, panicked frequency vibrating in their own chests. Grant immediately stepped forward, moving to shield his son. His face was flushed red, a potent mix of sleep deprivation and raw indignation. He instantly adopted the deep, authoritative baritone he utilized whenever he needed to bulldoze a corporate negotiation or intimidate a subordinate. "Zoe, you are completely overreacting," Grant declared, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. "This is a massive, disproportionate tantrum, even for you." He gestured wildly toward Mason, whose breathing was growing shallower by the second. "Do you possess any comprehension of what you are doing right now? You are going to detonate the entire house purchase. The sellers will put that property back on the market by Monday morning. You are threatening to jeopardize the entire wedding timeline, the financial deposits, and Mason's reputation, all over some petty, imagined slight." Before I could respond, Sloane maneuvered herself into the space beside Grant. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses pushed back into her meticulously highlighted hair, a heavy cashmere wrap draped elegantly over her shoulders to ward off the morning chill. She offered me a tight, patronizing smile, the exact expression a luxury boutique manager gives a customer whose credit card has just been declined. "Zoe, let us all just take a collective breath," Sloane interjected, her tone dripping with a manufactured, cloying diplomacy. "Mason was simply attempting to keep things elegant this weekend. The Penrose family has a very specific, traditional dynamic. He was just managing the optics of the situation. There is absolutely no need for you to escalate a minor logistical decision into a catastrophic financial crisis." I set my mug down on a cork coaster. I looked at Sloane's polished face, then shifted my gaze to Grant's reddening features, and finally locked my eyes entirely on Mason. The silence in the kitchen stretched out again, tightening like a steel cable ready to snap. I waited for Mason to step out from behind his father's bluster and his stepmother's public relations spin. I backed him into a corner using nothing but quiet observation. The sheer pressure broke him. Mason dragged a trembling hand through his hair, his remaining composure disintegrating completely. "They asked about you," Mason snapped, his voice cracking violently with defensive anger. Eliza's parents sat me down in their study and asked about my background. I had to give them a narrative that fit the environment. "I told them you were not really present while I was growing up." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor before snapping back to mine, filled with a desperate, cornered cruelty. "I told them we were distant. I told them you were always working, always distracted, and that my father was the primary anchor in my life. Bringing you to Richmond would have made everything too heavy. It would have forced me to explain a messy reality they do not understand. I just needed one perfect weekend, and now you are ruining my entire future because your feelings got hurt." The room went dead silent. Grant stopped pacing. Sloane's artificial smile vanished entirely. They braced themselves for the explosion. They waited for the wounded mother to scream, to break down sobbing, to demand a historical recount of every single meal cooked, every fever nursed, and every lonely night shift endured to keep a roof over his head. I offered them absolutely nothing of the sort. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked directly into my son's panicked, furious eyes. I did not withdraw the financial guarantee from my son, I stated, my voice dropping an octave, striking the stagnant air with absolute, chilling clarity. I withdrew it from a grown man who made a calculated decision to be ashamed of his own mother. Mason flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. "You are destroying my life," he yelled, slamming his fist against the granite counter so hard the coffee carafe rattled. "You are deliberately sabotaging my marriage and my home." The blistering heat of his anger crashed uselessly against the glacial wall of my resolve. I spoke colder than anger. I spoke with the absolute, terrifying authority of someone who held every single card and had just aggressively called their collective bluff. "You made your choice, Mason," I replied, watching the false bravado bleed completely out of his posture. "You want Grant and Sloane to play the role of your parents in front of the world. You want them to stand in the engagement photographs, toast with the champagne, and shake hands with the elite society of Virginia. That is perfectly fine. But you cannot have them as your parents on the social stage, while keeping me as a parent hidden away in your financial portfolio. If they are the parents you proudly present to the public, then they can be the parents who underwrite your real estate." Mason stared at me. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again, but absolutely no sound emerged. The crushing reality of his situation finally penetrated his panic. There was no negotiation to be had here. There was no emotional guilt trip that would pry my signature back onto those bank documents. I had cleanly severed the supply line, and he was entirely, terrifyingly exposed. He let out a choked, ragged sound of pure panic, spun on his heel, and bolted for the hallway. He shoved the back door open and practically sprinted toward his sleek sedan, leaving the door hanging wide open behind him. Grant lingered in the kitchen for a fraction of a second longer. His authoritative mask had slipped completely, revealing a deeply unsettled older man who suddenly realized he had vastly miscalculated the opponent standing in front of him. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his jaw tight with impotent rage. "This is not over, Zoe," Grant threw back, a vague, hollow threat designed purely to salvage a fraction of his bruised ego. He turned and followed Sloane, who was already retreating rapidly toward the silver crossover. I picked up my coffee mug, took another slow, deliberate sip of the dark roast, and watched their vehicles reverse out of my driveway. My older brother, Dean Campbell, pulled his heavy work truck into my driveway a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Dean is a commercial real estate appraiser, a man whose entire livelihood depends on looking past fresh coats of paint to locate the structural rot hidden deep inside the walls of a building. He does not suffer fools, and he has never possessed a high opinion of my ex-husband. I brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee, poured him a heavy ceramic mug, and laid out the exact sequence of events that had transpired over the weekend. I told him about the curated photograph in Richmond, the digital withdrawal of my loan guarantee, and the chaotic, desperate confrontation that had taken place in my kitchen that very morning. Dean listened without interrupting. He did not offer soft, sympathetic platitudes. He leaned back in his wooden dining chair, crossed his thick arms over his chest, and shook his head slowly. He told me immediately that I was viewing the situation through an entirely incorrect lens. This was not merely a case of an insecure young man feeling embarrassed by his working-class mother. Dean insisted that a humiliation of this magnitude, executed with such precision, was not born of simple vanity. It was a highly calculated performance, a staging ground with substantial, tangible financial benefits attached to it. Dean possesses a vast, quiet network of professional acquaintances spanning various industries across the eastern seaboard. He took a long sip of his black coffee and revealed what he had been hearing through the regional development grapevine over the past 6 months. Grant was not simply playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch in Virginia for the sake of his ego. He had been aggressively courting a notoriously exclusive syndicate of private equity investors based in and around the Richmond area. His ultimate objective was to secure tens of millions of dollars in funding for a massive, high-end boutique hotel development project. The Penrose family name carried immense, unquestionable weight in those exact financial circles. They were the gatekeepers to the exact vaults Grant needed to unlock. Furthermore, Dean explained, Sloane was playing her own parallel game. She had been quietly infiltrating the charity galas, the country club luncheons, and the historical preservation societies of the Virginia elite. Her objective was not merely social climbing, She was actively, ruthlessly positioning her firm to secure the incredibly lucrative interior design contract for Grant's proposed hotel. The cold, undeniable logic of their actions finally snapped into place inside my mind. I sat perfectly still at my kitchen table and watched the entire grand illusion reveal its underlying mechanical gears. Mason was not merely cutting me out of the picture to spare himself an awkward conversation about my career at the Transit Authority. He was functioning as the perfect, flawless bridge between the immense, established wealth of the Penrose family and the lucrative commercial world Grant was desperately trying to conquer. If Mason presented himself to Eliza's parents as the product of an unbroken, highly successful, and aesthetically flawless lineage, he gained unfettered access to the inner sanctum of Richmond society. By systematically erasing me from the narrative, Mason, Grant, and Sloane transformed themselves into a unified, immaculate package. They looked like a solid, risk-free investment. They possessed immense exchange value. A divorce transit safety investigator from the industrial outskirts simply did not fit the glossy pages of their prospectus. I was a liability to their business model, a rough edge that threatened to snag the delicate fabric of their financial ambitions. I left Dean in the kitchen and walked with deliberate purpose into my home office. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. I approached the heavy steel filing cabinets that lined the far wall. I am not a woman who operates on raw emotion. I operate on hard, verifiable evidence. I pulled open the heavy metal drawers and began extracting the reinforced cardboard storage boxes I had meticulously maintained for over 2 decades. I carried the heavy boxes to my large oak desk and started sorting through the physical, documented weight of my motherhood. I laid out the records, one by one, creating a timeline of undeniable reality. There were the court-stamped custody schedules from the divorce, proving precisely how many mandated weekends Grant had simply failed to appear. There were the faded carbon copies of tuition receipts from private tutors and summer enrichment camps, every single one paid from my personal checking account. I unearthed the medical consent forms for a severe pediatric appendectomy, bearing my signature on the line designated for the attending parent, dated on a Tuesday when Grant was supposedly unavailable on a corporate retreat. There were the bank transfer confirmations for the rent I had paid on Mason's first apartment when he lost his internship, and the thick, heavy folders detailing the maintenance, insurance, and eventual payoff of his first vehicle. As I sifted through the chronological strata of our lives, my fingers brushed against a thick, sealed manila envelope buried near the bottom of a box marked with a date from exactly 7 years ago. Mason was 20 years old at the time, a sophomore in college, desperately eager to fit in with a wealthy, chaotic fraternity. He had attended an off-campus party that had spiraled violently out of control. It had resulted in severe, malicious property damage to a rented historic townhouse. The local police had been called. Arrests were imminent. Mason had called me at 3 o'clock in the morning, weeping with absolute, unadulterated terror. Grant, true to form, had kept his phone turned off. I had driven 4 hours through the freezing dead of night to reach him. I had quietly engaged a highly skilled, incredibly expensive defense attorney. I had personally paid a private civil settlement of $25,000 straight out of my own retirement savings to ensure the property owner dropped all potential criminal charges. I did it solely so that my son's professional record would not be permanently destroyed before his adult life even had a chance to begin. I had buried the entire incident so deeply and so efficiently that I knew for an absolute certainty he had never mentioned a single word of it to Eliza or the pristine Penrose family. I stared at the settlement documents, running my thumb over the raised, embossed seal of the notary public. I was not gathering this arsenal out of a desire for malicious vengeance. I had no intention of marching down to Richmond and dumping these files onto the Penrose family's mahogany dining table just to watch the wedding burn down. I was simply a safety investigator doing what I had been trained to do for over 20 years. I was organizing the factual, undeniable history of the structure. I was preparing the actual blueprints, fortifying my position, and arming myself with the truth. just in case the people currently building a fragile house of cards ever attempted to force my hand. Dean walked into the office and leaned heavily against the wooden door frame, watching me work with silent, grim approval. He looked at the towering stacks of undeniably authentic documentation covering the surface of my desk. He offered me a tight, knowing smile. He reminded me of a very sharp, very fundamental truth about the exact kind of people we were dealing with. People who construct their entire existence around a curated image. People who use their social standing as currency and view relationships as transactions, are never truly afraid of angry phone calls or emotional outbursts. They thrive on drama because they can easily spin it to their advantage, labeling the other party as unstable or bitter, what they fear more than anything else in the entire world, Dean noted softly, is an airtight paper trail. Down in Virginia, the meticulously controlled atmosphere inside the Penrose family estate began to subtly but irrevocably curdle. Eliza, a woman raised to maintain absolute composure in any social weather, started noticing a distinct, abrasive shift in her fiancé. Mason was slowly unraveling. The sudden, unexplained suspension of the Alexandria property closing had triggered a series of sharp, highly uncharacteristic outbursts. He snapped at the catering director over the reception menu and paced the length of the family drawing room with his phone pressed aggressively to his ear. His voice clipped and strained. The polished, effortless charm that had initially won Eliza over was evaporating, replaced by a frantic, defensive energy. The breaking point for Eliza arrived on a quiet Tuesday evening. They were sitting in the library, attempting to finalize the guest list seating chart, when she finally cornered him with the most glaring, logical question in the room. She put down her pen, looked him directly in the eye, and asked why a mother he had consistently described as emotionally distant, erratic, and largely absent from his upbringing was the sole financial guarantor for their marital home. Mason physically recoiled from the question. He stumbled over his words, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He offered evasive, half-baked explanations about temporary liquidity issues and optimal tax brackets, stringing together corporate financial buzzwords that completely failed to answer the fundamental human question. He attempted to pivot the conversation back to Grant's vast real estate connections, claiming his father was simply restructuring his assets. But the harder Mason tried to deflect, the more defensive and hollow his cadence became. Eliza did not press further, but the silence she left in the wake of his stammering was heavy with newly planted suspicion. Caroline Penrose observed this rapid deterioration from a quiet, calculating distance. She was a woman who had spent over 5 decades navigating the unspoken rules and hidden agendas of high society. She possessed a finely tuned, almost predatory radar for inconsistency. Sitting in her private sunroom the following afternoon, she found her mind drifting back to the sprawling engagement party they had hosted several months prior. She recalled her incredibly brief interaction with me. Mason had previously painted a vivid, tragic picture of a chaotic woman who simply could not handle the pressures of domestic life. He described an unstable figure who had gracefully, if sadly, stepped aside to let Grant and the far more capable Sloane take the reins of his development. But the woman Caroline had actually met did not match that chaotic caricature in the slightest. She remembered a quiet, deeply dignified guest who wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, spoke in measured, intelligent tones, and observed the opulent surroundings with sharp, unclouded eyes. There had been no nervous instability in my handshake, no desperate need for attention in my posture. I had not drunk too much champagne, nor had I cornered any guest to complain about my past. Caroline realized, with a sudden chill of clarity, that the person she had briefly shared a conversation with was fundamentally incompatible with the ghost story her future son-in-law had been actively selling them. This quiet, nagging dissonance prompted Caroline to make a private, secure phone call to her sister-in-law, Nora Penrose. Nora was a formidable entity in her own right. Serving as the senior managing partner at the boutique law firm that handled the Penrose family trust, she spent her days dissecting impenetrable prenuptial agreements and tearing apart hostile corporate mergers. She could smell a fabricated narrative from 3 zip codes away. As soon as Caroline voiced her unease regarding the stalled condo and Mason's shifting explanations, Nora took it upon herself to conduct a quiet, methodical background check. She did not hire a private investigator or make any noisy inquiries. She simply utilized the public legal databases available to anyone with a law degree and a high-speed internet connection. Nora was a woman who believed entirely in the undeniable theology of a paper trail. Within 48 hours, Nora had pulled the public dockets from the Allegheny County Courthouse. She sat at her heavy mahogany desk and cross-referenced the finalized divorce filings, the court-ratified child custody agreements, and the historical residential tax addresses. The legal paper trail told a story that diametrically opposed Mason's carefully curated fiction. The documents clearly outlined joint custody where the primary physical and legal residence remained entirely with the mother. The property tax records confirmed I had maintained the exact same stable household for over a decade, while Grant had bounced between 3 different luxury apartments before marrying Sloan. Digging deeper into professional safety registries, Nora uncovered a formal commendation buried in an industry oversight newsletter from 4 years ago. I had been officially recognized by the Federal Transit Authority for independently identifying and documenting severe structural safety violations on a major commuter rail line, effectively preventing a catastrophic derailment. The profile that emerged from Nora's meticulous research was not that of a flaky, absent woman who needed to be hidden away. It was the undeniable profile of a highly competent, deeply serious professional with an absolutely spotless, organized record. Armed with this undeniable discrepancy, Caroline made her move. She did not confront Mason. She did not call Grant to demand an explanation. She went directly to the source of the contradiction. My phone rang at exactly 11 in the morning on a Thursday. I did not recognize the Virginia area code flashing on the screen, but I answered with my standard, professional greeting. Caroline introduced herself with flawless, icy politeness. She bypassed any superficial small talk about the weather or the upcoming wedding preparations. She moved straight to the point with the terrifyingly calm directness of a Southern matriarch who senses a threat to her family's ecosystem. She stated that the circumstances surrounding the suspended property closing had brought certain family dynamics to her immediate attention. She admitted that she was currently holding 2 wildly different versions of my son's history, and she preferred to hear the truth directly from the person who actually lived it, rather than the people currently trying to rewrite it. I stood in my home office, looking out at the bare branches of the oak tree in my backyard. I did not seize the opportunity to launch into a hysterical, vindictive tirade against my ex-husband. I did not try to poison her against Sloan, nor did I beg Caroline to believe my side of the story. I maintained the exact same level, objective vocal register I utilized when briefing a federal transport safety committee. I told her I would be willing to meet. I agreed to drive down to Richmond the following day, suggesting we convene privately at the offices of the Penrose Family Trust. I attached only one strict, non-negotiable condition to my visit. I informed Caroline that I would not be arriving to perform a domestic tragedy. I would not engage in a shouting match about hurt feelings, and I would not offer subjective opinions on Grant's character. I told her I would only be bringing the physical, documented truth, and I expected the conversation to remain strictly analytical. On the other end of the line, the briefest pause stretched across the cellular connection. In that single, suspended second of silence, Caroline Penrose fully understood the exact nature of the woman she was speaking to. She recognized the steady, unshakable cadence of someone who was anchored entirely by verifiable facts, a woman who possessed absolutely nothing to hide. It was the precise kind of immovable, terrifying gravity that liars, cowards, and social climbers always try to dismiss as simply being difficult or problematic. Caroline agreed to the terms immediately, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, signaling deep, mutual respect. The trap was officially set, not with malice or dramatic flair, but with the quiet, devastating power of simple, undeniable verification. I made the drive down Interstate 95 in complete, unbroken silence. It took exactly 6 hours to transition from the practical working-class steel bridges of Pittsburgh to the historic, ivy-draped brick facades of Richmond. I did not turn on the radio. I did not stop for coffee. I used the quiet hours inside the cabin of my car to mentally organize the sequence of paper I was about to present. I wore a tailored charcoal gray blazer, a simple white blouse, and dark trousers. I wore no jewelry besides a functional leather watch. I was not traveling to Virginia to compete with Sloane's designer wardrobe or the Penrose family aesthetic, nor was I there to beg for a seat at a banquet table. I carried a single, slim leather portfolio under my right arm. It contained less than 30 pages, but I knew those pages were heavy enough to sink a battleship. The Penrose Family Trust operated out of a beautifully restored, centuries-old bank building located deep in the financial district of the city. A silent, brass-paneled elevator took me to the 4th floor. The receptionist did not ask for my name. She simply gave a brief nod and guided me down a long, echoing corridor carpeted in thick, sound-absorbing wool. The conference room was dominated by a massive, polished walnut table that looked like it had hosted decades of corporate acquisitions. Caroline and Nora Penrose were already seated on one side. They did not stand when I entered. They did not offer a forced, sympathetic smile, and nobody rang for a secretary to bring a tray of chamomile tea to soothe my nerves. The atmosphere was perfectly sterile, completely devoid of pity, and charged with the quiet, high-stakes intensity of a legal deposition. I appreciated their coldness. It meant we could skip the polite theater and get straight to the anatomy of the lie. I took the heavy leather chair directly opposite them. I placed my portfolio flat on the polished wood, unzipped it, and pulled out the single stack of carefully curated files. "I appreciate you taking the time to see me," I began, my voice steady and echoing slightly against the glass walls of the room. "I will not waste it," I began at the point of the divorce, exactly 11 years ago, and moved strictly forward along the timeline. I pushed a certified, court-stamped copy of the custody ledger across the table. I instructed them to look at the highlighted dates. These were the dozens of weekends, holidays, and school vacations where Grant had simply forfeited his visitation rights. Next to it, I placed a thick stack of pediatric dental receipts, orthopedic bills, and the emergency surgical consent forms for a severe case of appendicitis. I showed them the school emergency contact sheets from Mason's junior high and high school years. My name was the only one listed as the primary responder. My signature was the only ink on the paper. When Mason was 23 years old, I stated, maintaining eye contact with Caroline, he secured a highly competitive summer internship in New York City. The position did not transition into a permanent job offer, and he remained unemployed for the following 7 months. His father was traveling through Europe with his new wife at the time. I slid a neat stack of bank transfer confirmations across the walnut surface. I covered his rent, his groceries, and his utility bills during that entire period. He did not miss a single payment, and he never faced eviction because the money left my checking account on the 1st of every month. I paused. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of Nora's wristwatch. The two women looked at the financial transfers, absorbing the mundane, undeniable reality of a mother keeping her adult child afloat. I reached back into the stack and pulled out a sealed, heavy manila envelope. I kept my hand resting flat on top of it for a moment, gathering the precise words I needed. "I am not here to destroy my son's reputation out of spite," I told the two women sitting quietly across from me. "I am not looking for revenge. But you need to understand the exact mechanics of how he manages a crisis when the cameras are turned off." I slid the heavy packet forward. When Mason was 20 years old, he attended an off-campus fraternity event that resulted in severe malicious property damage to a historic rental home. Criminal charges were pending. It was a situation that would have permanently derailed his academic and professional future. His father turned his phone off and refused to intervene. I drove 4 hours in the middle of the night. I hired a highly specialized defense attorney, and I paid a $25,000 civil settlement directly out of my own retirement savings to ensure the property owner dropped the charges. Caroline's eyes flicked from the settlement amount up to my face. She did not say a word, but her jaw tightened visibly. I looked right back at her, refusing to break the connection. Mason has always had a mother who was very heavily present, I said, my tone remaining entirely level, stripped of any theatrical sorrow. Whenever his life derailed, I was the one who showed up to put it back on the tracks. He simply does not like to mention the mechanic when he is trying to show off the shiny car to a new audience. Nora picked up the settlement document, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with the rapid, predatory speed of a seasoned trust lawyer. She checked the dates, the signatures, and the notary seals, but before she could finish processing the weight of that buried secret, I reached into the portfolio one last time. I pulled out the 6-page mortgage guarantor agreement from the National Bank. I placed it squarely in the center of the table, directly in their line of sight. This, I said, tapping my index finger against my own signature on the final page, was executed less than 8 weeks ago. The air in the room seemed to physically drop in temperature. Nora stopped reading the college settlement and stared at the fresh ink date on the banking documents. Caroline closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the only visible sign of the profound shock registering in her system. This was the lethal blow. The childhood neglect story could, in a highly generous mind, be chalked up to a bitter divorce and a child's warped, emotional perception of the past. But a legally binding financial guarantee, signed less than 2 months prior to this wedding, completely annihilated the narrative of an estranged, unstable mother. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Mason was not just lying about his history. He was actively, ruthlessly exploiting me in the absolute present, utilizing my flawless credit to secure his luxury condominium, all while publicly replacing me with Sloane on his social media feeds. Nora slowly gathered the documents into a neat, squared pile. She looked at me, her expression guarded but entirely devoid of the polite skepticism she might have harbored an hour ago. She stated clearly that they would not be making any immediate emotional judgments. As a fiduciary and an attorney, she informed me that she would personally verify every single routing number, court stamp, and notary seal on the documents I had provided. Caroline folded her hands on the table. She added, with a voice as cold as winter ice, that what they were looking at was no longer just a bridegroom's white lie to smooth over a messy family tree. It was hard, documented evidence of a highly curated, deeply deceptive personality constructed specifically for social and financial elevation. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I did not ask what they were going to do with the information. I did not ask if they planned to cancel the wedding or confront Grant about his hotel development schemes. My job was simply to deliver the blueprints of the burning building. It was up to them whether they still wanted to move their daughter inside. I zipped my empty portfolio shut, thanked them evenly for their time, and walked out of the conference room. I rode the brass elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the crisp, clear Virginia afternoon. I unlocked my car and started the engine. I felt an immense, physical weight lift off my shoulders, leaving behind a sharp, clean emptiness. I had no idea how the Penrose family would handle the wreckage I had just laid on their table, but I knew one absolute truth as I merged back onto the highway. If they chose to walk Eliza down the aisle and hand her over to Mason now, it would no longer be because they were lacking the correct information. It took less than 24 hours for the shockwave to travel from the mahogany conference table in Virginia directly to my cell phone. I was standing in the quiet aisle of a local hardware store, inspecting a heavy brass deadbolt, when my screen lit up with Mason's number. I answered on the third ring. He did not bother with a customary greeting. His voice came through the small speaker entirely stripped of its usual polished, measured resonance. Instead, it was vibrating with a raw, unhinged fury. He had clearly just spoken to his fiancée. Someone within the Penrose family had asked him a highly specific, targeted question that completely shattered his carefully constructed reality. He demanded to know exactly what I had said to Caroline and Nora. Before I could offer a single syllable in response, He launched into a blistering, frantic tirade. He accused me of deliberately burning his entire future to the ground simply because my own personal ego had been bruised. He shouted that I was punishing him for being successful, that I was actively trying to ruin the best thing that had ever happened to him out of sheer, vindictive jealousy. He framed my delivery of the legal documents not as an act of objective truth, but as an act of malicious sabotage orchestrated by a bitter, left-behind woman. I listened to his frantic breathing through the receiver. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I calmly informed him that I had only provided the exact paperwork he himself had generated. If his future in-laws were currently upset, they were upset by his own documented actions, not my ego. He hung up on me with a violent, echoing click. Less than 2 hours later, Grant called. In the 11 years since our divorce, Grant had meticulously maintained a facade of condescending, smooth diplomacy whenever we were forced to interact. That polished facade completely disintegrated the second I answered the phone. He was practically snarling. He bypassed any pretense of defending Mason's emotional well-being and cut straight to the terrifying reality of his own bleeding wallet. He revealed, in a barrage of sharp, venomous accusations, that the sudden tension radiating from the Penrose estate was actively infecting his commercial endeavors. 2 massive private equity investors in the Richmond area had abruptly stopped returning his phone calls that very morning. A highly anticipated scheduled luncheon with a major commercial developer had been suddenly canceled without a rescheduled date. Grant demanded to know what kind of poison I had poured into the ears of the Penrose family. He threatened aggressive legal action, claiming I was intentionally interfering with his business contracts. He was bleeding capital, and he was terrified. I simply reminded him that I possessed absolutely no power over private equity firms, and if his investors were backing away, perhaps they had simply realized the foundation of his pitch was entirely hollow. By the end of the week, my brother Dean drove over to my house to deliver another piece of the unraveling puzzle. Through his extensive network of regional appraisers and country club members, Dean had caught wind of Sloane's desperate damage control campaign. She was aggressively working her social phone lines, scheduling emergency lunches with mutual acquaintances, and frantically spinning a brand new narrative. She was telling anyone who would listen that I was deeply unstable, a woman who had never truly recovered from the trauma of her divorce. Sloane painted me as a desperate, attention-seeking ex-wife who was actively trying to steal the spotlight and sabotage her own son's happiness, because I could not bear to see Grant living a successful, glamorous life. They were all reacting exactly as cornered animals do. They were attacking the messenger because the message itself was absolutely undeniable. The most disturbing communication, however, arrived in my electronic inbox late on a Sunday evening. It was an email from Mason, stretching over 1,000 words long. He had clearly spent days drafting, editing, and polishing the text, attempting to sound like a grounded, mature man seeking reconciliation. He utilized modern therapy language and corporate buzzwords. He wrote extensively about the immense societal pressure he felt trying to bridge the gap between his working-class roots and the elite circles of Washington and Virginia. He blamed the logistical trauma of growing up between 2 separate households. He claimed that omitting me from the Richmond trip was simply a misguided attempt to compartmentalize his life for the sake of efficiency. He even wrote that he wanted to protect me from the harsh scrutiny of the old money elite, framing his exclusion as an act of twisted mercy. It was a brilliant piece of public relations spin, designed to make him the tragic hero of his own deception. I sat in my dark office, reading the lengthy paragraphs glowing on my computer monitor. A cold, heavy dread settled deep inside my chest. It was not anger. It was a terrifying realization regarding the fundamental nature of my own child. Nowhere in those 1,000 words did Mason actually acknowledge that he had exploited me. He did not apologize for secretly using my financial credit while publicly replacing me with Sloane. He completely bypassed the moral bankruptcy of his actions. He did not believe he had done anything truly wrong. He only believed that he had employed a poor strategy that resulted in an excessively harsh penalty. He was not sorry for the betrayal. He was only sorry that he had been caught, and he was desperately trying to negotiate his way out of the consequences. While Mason and Grant scrambled to control the narrative on their end, Nora Penrose was operating with silent, lethal efficiency down in Richmond. I would later learn exactly how thoroughly she dismantled their lies. Nora did not rely on country club gossip. She contacted the senior loan officers at the National Bank. She quietly requisitioned the municipal court archives regarding the fraternity vandalism incident. She verified every single date, routing number, and signature on the documents I had left on her conference table. Within 3 days, Nora had completely validated my entire timeline. The data was absolutely flawless, leaving Mason and Grant with zero room for plausible deniability. But the crushing twist did not come from the bank statements or the old court records. It came directly from Everett Penrose, Eliza's father. Everett was a man who commanded immense wealth, and he possessed an inherent, protective suspicion of anyone trying to stand too close to his vault. Prompted by the growing concerns of his wife and sister, Everett began making his own quiet inquiries within his private financial circles. He quickly uncovered the exact nature of Grant's recent business meetings. He discovered that Grant had been aggressively name-dropping the Penrose Family Trust in closed-door equity pitches. Grant had been explicitly leveraging his son's upcoming marriage to Eliza as a guaranteed pathway to secure institutional funding for his boutique hotel project. Everett learned that Grant had assured a syndicate of private lenders that the Penrose family was unofficially backing the venture. Furthermore, Sloan's interior design firm was heavily featured in the preliminary pitch decks as the exclusive vendor, promising investors a direct pipeline to the aesthetic standards of the Virginia elite. The entire horrifying picture finally solidified for the Penrose family. They realized that while Eliza and Mason might share a genuine, emotional connection, the marriage itself was completely surrounded by a predatory scaffolding of financial ambition. Mason, Grant, and Sloan had systematically deleted me from the family portrait because my presence disrupted the illusion of a flawless, wealthy dynasty. Cutting me out made them look like a clean, highly lucrative investment opportunity. I was not just a social embarrassment. I was a threat to their commercial bottom line. A lesser family might have reacted with explosive outrage. They might have immediately canceled the catering, rescinded the invitations, and thrown Mason out of their home in a public spectacle. But the Penrose family operated on a much higher, far more ruthless level of social strategy. They made a collective decision behind closed doors. They chose not to confront Mason with the mountain of evidence Nora had compiled. They chose not to call Grant and demand an explanation for his predatory business tactics. Instead, they decided to maintain absolute, terrifying silence. They would proceed with the scheduled events. They wanted to take one more step forward, allowing the wedding machinery to continue turning, simply to observe how much further Mason and Grant were willing to go. They wanted to see exactly how many more lies the three of them would tell when they falsely believed their secrets were still safely hidden in the dark. The Penrose family owned a sprawling heritage inn nestled in the lush, rolling hills just outside the city limits of Richmond. It was a structure built of weathered stone and dark, heavy timber, a place where the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke and expensive beeswax. This was the chosen battleground for the pre-wedding logistical summit. The itinerary spanned 2 full days, specifically designed to finalize the ceremonial timeline, review the floral arrangements, and most crucially, execute the final signatures on the prenuptial and financial trust agreements. Mason had operated under the absolute ironclad assumption that my invitation had been permanently revoked. He had spent the preceding 2 weeks solidifying his narrative, painting me as a fragile, volatile entity best left out of high society functions. His delusion held firm until exactly 4 o'clock on the Thursday before the gathering. My phone rang. It was Caroline Penrose. She did not offer a lengthy preamble or a formal, embossed invitation. She simply stated that the final dinner arrangements were being set. "I prefer a fully occupied table," Caroline told me, her voice as smooth and unyielding as polished marble. "We expect you at 6 o'clock on Friday evening." I arrived at the inn precisely on time. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires, signaling my approach to the gathered assembly on the sprawling wraparound porch. I did not arrive wearing a vengeance dress. I wore a simple, impeccably tailored charcoal wool coat over a navy silk blouse and dark trousers. I wore no aggressive jewelry. I had absolutely no desire to engage in a sartorial arms race with Sloane. My quiet, unadorned arrival was precisely what shattered Mason's remaining composure. Had I arrived weeping, screaming, or dressed to provoke, he could have easily pointed a triumphant finger and whispered to the Penrose family that I was exactly the unstable disruption he had warned them about. But my profound, unbreakable calm terrified him. When I walked through the heavy oak doors, his face drained of color, he stood frozen by the fireplace, his knuckles turning white around his crystal tumbler of bourbon. Grant and Sloane, conversely, immediately launched into an aggressive, highly choreographed theatrical performance. They were desperately trying to play the roles of the established, wealthy patriarch and the elegant, supportive stepmother. Sloane glided across the antique Persian rugs, her wrists dripping with heavy gold bracelets, touching the arms of the Penrose extended family and laughing with a forced, musical trill. Grant stood near the bar, swirling an expensive scotch, offering unsolicited opinions on the current state of commercial real estate to anyone polite enough to listen. They clinked glasses, offered sweeping toasts to the upcoming union, and behaved entirely as if the structural foundation of their lives was not currently fracturing beneath their designer shoes. However, the audience they were performing for had already read the script. Eliza sat quietly on a velvet sofa, a half-empty glass of sparkling water resting on her knee. She was no longer looking at her fiancé with the blind, absolute adoration of a bride-to-be. She was watching him with the sharp, analytical gaze of a woman dissecting a stranger. She began to notice the small, lethal micro-expressions that completely betrayed his polished exterior. Whenever I entered a room, Mason would physically shift his weight, angling his shoulders to block me from his immediate line of sight. If a conversation naturally drifted toward my direction, he would swiftly and aggressively cut me off before I could finish a single sentence. He expertly hijacked the dialogue, steering the topic back to safe, superficial waters like the catering menu or the groomsman's attire. Most damning of all, Eliza noticed the precise moments his voice would suddenly drop half an octave, softening into a deeply manipulative, soothing cadence whenever he felt he was losing control of the room's perception. The suffocating tension peaked on Saturday morning inside the inn's private library. Nora Penrose had requested a final review of the legal and financial parameters surrounding the marital trust. The room was lined with centuries-old books, the air thick and heavy with the scent of old paper and leather. Nora sat behind a massive desk, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, a terrifyingly neat stack of manila folders resting before her. Under the guise of finalizing the prenuptial schedules, Nora began asking Mason a series of highly specific, surgically precise questions regarding his current assets. She requested supplemental documentation regarding his independent savings, the precise origin of the down payment funds for the Alexandria property, and the timeline of his supposed financial independence. Mason began to sweat. He shifted uncomfortably in his leather wingback chair. The confident, self-made branding executive facade dissolved into the stuttering, evasive panic of a cornered adolescent. Every answer he provided directly contradicted a previous statement he had made months prior. He tried to blur the lines of his financial history, relying on vague terms like liquid capital and family-assisted restructuring, but Nora did not let a single discrepancy slide. She pinned him down with cold, undeniable arithmetic, exposing the massive, gaping holes in the story of the independent wealth he had so proudly boasted about. Standing by the tall, mullioned windows, Everett Penrose watched the entire interrogation without saying a single word. Everett had spent the previous 72 hours utilizing his own formidable corporate network. He had fully confirmed every single whisper regarding Grant's predatory business maneuvers. Everett knew for an absolute fact that the man currently pretending to be a benevolent, wealthy father was actively using the Penrose family name as collateral to secure a multi-million-dollar boutique hotel investment. Everett looked at Grant not as a future relative, but as a liability attempting to breach his vault. Eliza sat silently beside Mason during the financial review. She did not intervene to save him. She simply watched the man she was supposed to marry drown in his own fabricated reality. In that stifling, wood-paneled room, the final piece of her romantic illusion shattered completely. She finally understood that she was not standing beside a groom who merely possessed a complicated, messy family tree. She was legally binding herself to a man who viewed the human beings in his life as entirely disposable props. Mason was a man who ruthlessly edited his own reality, cutting out the people who did not fit the aesthetic requirements of his current audience, and utilizing the rest for whatever social or financial currency they could provide. During the Saturday evening formal dinner, the grand dining room of the inn felt less like a celebration and more like a tribunal. The long table was set with heavy sterling silver, crystal goblets, and low arrangements of white orchids. I was seated near the end of the table, a strategic placement by Caroline that allowed me a clear, unobstructed view of the entire theater. Grant was seated near the center, attempting to dominate the conversation with a loud, boisterous anecdote about a recent golf trip to Scotland. His laughter boomed across the room, but it was entirely hollow, echoing sharply against the stone walls. Sloane sat rigidly beside him, her smile tight and brittle. She spent the entire meal aggressively pushing her expensive food around her porcelain plate, her eyes darting nervously toward Caroline and Nora, desperately trying to read the temperature of the room. She was accustomed to controlling the social weather, but here, in the heart of the Penrose domain, she was entirely powerless. I focused my attention on my roasted lamb, eating methodically, speaking only when spoken to. I did not need to launch an offensive. The Penrose family was executing a flawless siege entirely on their own. Nora would occasionally ask Grant a seemingly innocent question about his hotel development timelines, her tone dripping with polite curiosity, watching with clinical detachment as he stumbled through his inflated projections. Mason drank 3 glasses of wine in rapid succession. His face was flushed, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He kept glancing in my direction, his eyes silently begging me to cause a scene, to do anything that would distract the room from the suffocating pressure closing in around him. He wanted me to be the villain he had described, the chaotic force that ruined dinners, but I remained perfectly still, a quiet mirror reflecting the total collapse of his carefully constructed world. The dessert course was cleared away by silent, uniformed staff. The heavy oak doors of the dining room remained shut. Nobody made a move to retire to the drawing room for after-dinner drinks. The air grew impossibly thick, heavy with the unspoken truth that had hijacked the entire weekend. The Penrose family moved through the motions of a joyous celebration, but everyone in the building could feel the immense, crushing weight of the inevitable. They were not preventing a catastrophic explosion. They were simply locking the doors and delaying the blast until the blast radius suited their own terms. The air at noon on the day of the rehearsal dinner was unseasonably warm, carrying the thick scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. I stepped out onto the expansive rear portico of the Heritage Inn to escape the suffocating courtesy of the indoor parlors. The wooden floorboards groaned softly under my sensible leather shoes. I had not been standing there for more than 2 minutes when the heavy glass door swung open. Mason stepped outside. For the very first time since this entire ordeal began, my son had entirely abandoned his meticulously constructed veneer. His shoulders sagged under the weight of an invisible, crushing pressure. The bespoke suit he wore seemed suddenly too large for his frame. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 48 hours desperately bailing water out of a sinking ship. He did not look like a rising branding executive from Washington. He looked exactly like the terrified 20-year-old boy who had called me in the middle of the night all those years ago, begging me to save him from his own reckless choices. He stopped 3 feet away from me. He shoved his hands deep into his trouser pockets, his jaw working silently before he finally managed to speak. He asked me to please just give him a pass for the evening. He told me that if I could just remain quiet, if I could just let tonight proceed without any sudden movements, everything would eventually settle down. He promised that after the wedding was over, after the contracts were signed and the ink was dry, we could all sit down together in a private room and discuss the situation like mature adults. I listened to the desperate, ragged edge of his voice. I did not feel a sudden surge of maternal warmth. I felt the cold, analytical detachment of an investigator reviewing a fundamentally flawed system. I heard the undeniable truth hiding beneath his request. Mason was not offering an apology for discarding me. He was not expressing remorse for the profound cruelty of erasing my existence from his public life. He was simply negotiating for a temporary ceasefire. He wanted a stay of execution just long enough to secure his image and lock down his future. He shifted his weight, unable to maintain eye contact. He offered a halting, half-finished concession. He admitted that he had perhaps handled the logistics poorly. He confessed that the execution of the weekend had been clumsy. Yet, even in his absolute desperation, he completely refused to utter the actual truth. He could not bring himself to admit that he had deliberately fabricated a false history, or that he had actively utilized his supposedly absent mother as a silent financial instrument to fund his luxury lifestyle. He called his betrayal a logistical error. I looked out over the rolling green hills of the Virginia countryside. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to force a confession he was incapable of giving. I established a very simple, unyielding boundary. I told him I had absolutely no intention of standing up in the middle of the dining room and creating a chaotic spectacle. I assured him I would not shout, I would not throw my wine, and I would not initiate a public confrontation. I told him he did not need to fear a dramatic scene from me. But I also made one condition absolutely clear. I told him that if a member of the Penrose family asked me a direct, specific question about my life, my finances, or my history with him, I would not lie. I would no longer act as the silent guarantor for his illusions. Mason swallowed hard. He understood exactly what that meant. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and retreated back inside the inn, looking more terrified than when he had emerged. 2 hours later, I found myself seated in a secluded reading room adjacent to the main lobby. Caroline Penrose entered quietly, closing the heavy mahogany doors behind her. She took the armchair directly opposite mine. The polite, superficial distance she had maintained during our first meeting in Richmond was entirely gone. She looked at me with the grim, resolute solidarity of a woman preparing for an unavoidable conflict. She did not mince her words. Caroline informed me that Nora had spent the previous several days conducting a thorough, exhaustive verification of the files I had provided. The bank executives had confirmed the active status of the mortgage guarantee. The municipal archives had validated the settlement of the property damage. The timeline of Grant's residential history and financial neglect had been corroborated by public tax records. Caroline folded her hands neatly in her lap. She stated that the elaborate structure Mason and Grant had built was currently standing on absolutely nothing. The only way their fabricated reality could continue to exist was if the Penrose family made a collective, conscious decision to close their eyes and pretend they did not see the rot. And the Penrose family, she assured me with quiet steel in her voice, did not accumulate their legacy by ignoring liabilities. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the estate, I received one final, unexpected visitor. Eliza found me sitting alone in the conservatory. She looked incredibly small, stripped of the bridal radiance that had defined her presence just weeks prior. She sat beside me on a wrought iron bench, staring blankly at the glass panels. She did not ask about the mortgage or the custody papers. She asked the single, most devastating question a person can ask before stepping up to an altar. She turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and asked if Mason truly loved her, or if she was nothing more than a convenient door to a world he desperately wanted to enter. I looked at the young woman who had almost become my daughter-in-law. I felt no malice toward her. I did not want to destroy her heart merely to punish my son. I spoke with gentle, absolute honesty. I told her that human beings are vastly complicated creatures. I explained that it is entirely possible for a man to harbor genuine, authentic affection for a woman, while simultaneously viewing her family as a highly lucrative acquisition. I told her that both of those realities could easily coexist in the dark. But, I added softly, when you finally turn on the glaring lights of truth, only one of those motivations is strong enough to survive the exposure. Eliza absorbed my words in complete silence. She did not cry. She simply thanked me, her voice barely above a whisper, and walked slowly out of the room. Night eventually fell over the Virginia hills. The rehearsal dinner was staged in the grand pavilion attached to the rear of the inn. It was a masterpiece of orchestrated elegance. The room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of dozens of floating candles. The tables were draped in crisp, immaculate white linen and set with heavy crystal goblets that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Soft, classical music played from a string quartet positioned in the corner. The speeches had been meticulously drafted and rehearsed. It was the absolute pinnacle of aesthetic perfection, the ideal stage for a flawlessly fake family. I sat at my assigned seat, watching the machinery of the evening turn. Grant was in his element. He wore a tailored tuxedo, a fresh silk pocket square tucked perfectly into his breast pocket. He was laughing loudly, slapping the shoulders of the Penrose men, behaving entirely like a victorious general celebrating the end of a long, highly profitable campaign. As the main course was cleared away and the champagne glasses were filled for the toasts, Grant stood up from his chair. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute, the sharp, ringing sound cutting through the low murmur of conversation. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward him. He raised his glass high, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, flashing a brilliant, triumphant smile toward his son and his future in-laws. He stood there, a man entirely convinced of his own brilliance, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already vanished. He had absolutely no idea that in this precise, golden second, the meticulously crafted masks of the groom, the father, and the stepmother were finally about to drop. Grant stood at the head of the long, formal dining table. He raised his crystal flute of vintage champagne, the warm, golden candlelight reflecting off his perfectly white teeth. He projected his deep voice across the grand pavilion, addressing the gathered Penrose family with the practiced, effortless ease of a seasoned politician. "To Everett and Caroline," Grant began, his tone rich with a heavily manufactured warmth. "Thank you for welcoming us so graciously into your incredible family estate. But more importantly, thank you for embracing the people who raised Mason, the people who molded him into the exceptional, driven young man sitting beside your beautiful daughter tonight." He gestured expansively toward Sloane, who offered a demure, flawlessly practiced dip of her chin. She was playing the role of the proud, foundational matriarch to absolute perfection. They were aggressively attempting to cement their status right there in front of the gathered elite, locking in the narrative before the wedding day arrived. Before a single guest could raise their glass to echo the sentiment, a sharp, crystalline sound cut right through the golden atmosphere of the room. Eliza had placed her champagne flute back onto the crisp linen tablecloth. She did not merely set it down. She brought it down with a heavy, deliberate force that demanded immediate attention. She did not stand up from her chair. She did not raise her voice to a shout. She simply looked directly across the elaborate floral centerpiece at Mason. "So," Eliza said, her voice dropping to a conversational whisper that somehow carried enough weight to instantly freeze the entire room. "If the two people who raised you are the ones currently taking a bow and claiming the credit, I have a very simple question. Who exactly was the guarantor for your luxury condominium? 6 weeks ago? Was it the mother you claimed was completely absent from your life, or was it the mother you intentionally hid from us?" The silence that rapidly descended upon the pavilion was absolute and terrifying. It was so profoundly heavy that I could clearly hear the metallic scrape of a silver dessert spoon accidentally hitting a porcelain plate at the far end of the room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Mason went entirely rigid in his tailored suit, All the blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray beneath the warm lighting. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. Before Grant could attempt to deploy a charming, diplomatic deflection to save his son, Nora Penrose moved. She sat near the center of the table, flanked by the wealthy patriarchs of the extended family. She did not offer a polite smile. She reached down into a sleek leather portfolio resting beside her chair and calmly placed a thick stack of duplicated documents directly onto the center of the dining table, right next to the white orchids. Nora's voice was the auditory equivalent of an ice pick. We have spent the last 48 hours verifying some rather interesting discrepancies regarding the history of the groom. Right here on top is the verified bank guarantee for the property in Alexandria, signed entirely by the woman sitting silently at the end of this table. Beneath that financial agreement, you will find the wire transfer receipts for university tuition, the finalized child custody ledgers proving her primary residence, emergency pediatric surgical records, and the finalized legal paperwork for a $25,000 civil settlement paid out during his second year of college to keep him out of jail. Sloane physically recoiled from the table, as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. Grant stared at the stack of undeniable proof, his jaw unhinging slightly as his brain struggled to process the total destruction of his lies. Caroline Penrose leaned forward, her posture terrifyingly regal and composed. She looked at Mason with a potent mixture of pity and absolute disgust. "We are not naive people, Mason," Caroline stated evenly, her tone devoid of any maternal warmth. "We live in the real world. We can entirely accept a fractured family. We can accept a messy divorce and a complicated upbringing. What we absolutely will not accept under any circumstances is a man who purposefully erases his own biological mother from his resume simply to sell us a cleaner, more profitable narrative." Mason swallowed hard, his hands trembling violently against his knees. "Eliza, please," he stammered, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You have to understand. The situation is so much more complicated than that. The social dynamics, the intense pressure to fit in with your world." "Do not talk to my daughter about social pressure," Everett Penrose interrupted. The patriarch of the family did not yell, but his deep baritone voice commanded the space like a wooden gavel striking a judge's block. Everett turned his piercing gaze away from the crumbling groom and aimed it directly at Grant. "And do not insult our intelligence by pretending this was just the clumsy, misguided mistake of an insecure young man," Everett continued, ruthlessly dismantling the final layer of their grand illusion. "I made a few discreet phone calls to the commercial equity syndicate in Richmond yesterday morning. I know exactly what you have been doing. Grant, you have been explicitly leveraging my daughter's upcoming marriage to open restricted doors for your boutique hotel project. You promised those wealthy investors that the Penrose Family Trust was unofficially backing your venture. And your lovely wife sitting beside you was quietly positioning her interior design firm to secure the vendor contracts." Everett paused for a fraction of a second, letting the sheer predatory nature of their actions hang thickly in the air. This was never about a young man feeling shy about his working-class background. This was a highly calculated, synchronized business maneuver. Deleting your ex-wife from the picture made the three of you look like a unified, risk-free investment. You used our family name as financial collateral, and you used this wedding as a networking event. Grant's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. For the very first time in the 11 years since our divorce, the smooth, silver-tongued salesman was completely out of material. He opened his mouth, stammered a half-formed syllable, and shut it again. Sloane's elegant, untouchable facade shattered entirely. She looked small, terrified, and painfully out of her depth, gripping the edge of the mahogany table as if the floor beneath her were tilting. Mason turned desperately back to Eliza, reaching across the white tablecloth to grab her hand. "Eliza, I love you. The business side of things, my father's projects, that has absolutely nothing to do with us. I swear to you, we can fix this. Families are just complicated. Eliza pulled her hand away smoothly, completely refusing his touch. She looked at him with a devastating, heartbreaking clarity that signaled the absolute end of her romantic illusion. A complicated family does not kill a marriage, Mason, Eliza said softly, her words echoing loudly in the completely silent room. Strategic, weaponized deception does. With slow, deliberate movements, Eliza reached for her left hand. She slid the heavy, flawless diamond engagement ring over her knuckle. She did not throw it at him in a fit of rage. She simply placed it gently onto the pristine white tablecloth, directly beside his dinner plate. "The wedding is canceled," Eliza announced, her voice trembling just slightly, but her resolve remaining absolute. "I cannot, and I will not, legally bind myself to a man who treats the woman who raised him like a dirty stain that needs to be scrubbed out, but still reaches into her pocket to use her as a resource the very moment he needs a loan." Everett stood up from his chair, signaling the absolute and immediate end of the evening. "The Penrose family is withdrawing all financial support for this event effective immediately," he declared, looking down at the ruined men before him. "And I assure you, any ongoing or future business discussions regarding your hotel development within the state of Virginia are permanently terminated." The social execution was complete. There was no screaming, no shattered glass, no physical violence. It was just the cold, brutal application of the truth, stripping them of every single thing they had tried to steal. Mason sat entirely frozen, staring blankly at the diamond ring resting beside his silver fork. Grant looked like a deflated balloon. His posture collapsed, his grand commercial ambitions reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. Sloane was staring at her lap, utterly humiliated in front of the exact high society she had so desperately tried to conquer. I did not deliver a dramatic, triumphant speech. I did not need to twist the knife or gloat over the smoking ruins of their ambitions. The wreckage they had created for themselves spoke entirely for itself. I simply stood up from my chair. I picked up my charcoal wool coat from the back of the seat. I did not look at Grant. I did not look at Sloane. And I did not look at the son who had tried to turn me into a ghost for his own benefit. I turned my back on the dining table and walked out of the pavilion in total, unbroken silence. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out onto the wide, wraparound porch of the Heritage Inn. The night sky over Virginia was vast, dark, and completely clear. The autumn wind sweeping across the rolling green hills was freezing, sharp, and incredibly clean. I breathed it in deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp air. For the first time in over a decade, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since the divorce was completely gone. As I walked down the wooden steps toward the gravel driveway, a very simple, undeniable truth finally settled deep into my bones. The person who should feel ashamed was never the working-class mother who was hidden away. The truly shameful ones were the pathetic people who desperately needed to hide her, simply to make their own hollow lies look a little more polite. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please let me know where you are tuning in from in the comments below, so we can interact and share our thoughts together. And if you enjoyed it, I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.